Excellent. Let's do this. I'm stoked. Okay. So last week, in part one of this message, I laid some groundwork for how I'll be exploring our ethos of it all belongs as it relates to religious diversity within community. Specifically, we are going to do this by leaning into this portion of Paul's letter to the church in Rome. And if you missed last week, I do recommend checking it out like later or sometime this week when we're done here, because I think it is really helpful to clear out some of the reasonable debris that might hold some of us from seeing much, if any, value in listening to and learning from Paul. In short, Paul was, in this section in Romans, he's trying to keep this newly established community of churches in Rome from fracturing along various lines, including ethnic divisions between the Jewish and Gentile Christians, and then religious divisions between what he called those who were weak in faith and those who are strong in faith. And we're getting closer to exploring what those two words mean. For today, which will be part two, as I said, and I really do believe a three-part message. I thought what I could do is explore why any given community, one like ours here at Sojourn or like the church in Rome, might find itself in a situation where help would be needed to navigate the tensions of religious diversity. And then next week, I'd like to cast a vision with you for how a community like ours can really thrive even when, or maybe even especially when, its members are all across the board of religious beliefs. I really do like about 90% of what Paul suggests as a path for how to handle divergent beliefs. I give him a solid B+. You have to tune in next week to find out why that is. But for today, first, we're going to go back to the start of the beginning of chapter 14 in verse 1, which starts like this. Now, accept the one who is weak in faith. Accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on their opinions. A quick word about that phrase, passing judgment on their opinions. There's two Greek words here. First is diakrisis, which means to discern or to pass judgment. And then second is this word dialogismos. Dialogismos, which is, think of it as like unsettled reasoning or doubtful thinking. And this is why I really like the New American Standard Translation here, because I think it captures well what Paul was saying, which is basically this. Hey, y'all who are strong in faith, you need to welcome the weaker ones among you, and please, for the love of God, don't criticize their opinions. And opinions, or dialogismos, Paul is referring to, I might say, these ideas or these beliefs that are not what you might call core values of the community. So that's the first thing I want to point out this morning. In any conversation around religious diversity within a faith community like ours, we must appreciate that there is a difference between core values and dialogismos, or what I'll henceforth refer to as doubtful matters. There's a difference between core values and doubtful matters. Unless you're in a fundamentalist cult where everyone believes the same thing, within any given community, there will always be these, quote, doubtful matters. And it's fine, it's normal, it's even good. But diversity over doubtful matters is different from diversity of core values. In Paul's case, he was writing to people who all shared these core values of living in the ways of Jesus for the sake of bringing the kingdom of God to earth as it is in heaven. Meaning, there existed these larger ties involving a commitment to a particular way of life that bound them together as one big, diverse, quirky family. And for us here at Sojourn, and I mentioned this last week, we don't have a formal statement of beliefs, which I think oftentimes are a church's way of seeking uniformity in some of these doubtful matters. But we do very much have core values that bind us together. For instance, and this is especially timely for Pride Month here, one of our mission-critical core values is that all people are loved children of God, with special emphasis on those whom society has traditionally marginalized. Meaning, while we welcome diversity of belief, for example, around, doubtful matters like, the theology of the Trinity or the efficacy of Scripture. Sure, diversity of belief is great on that. We do not, however, practice that same commitment to holding space for diverging beliefs around the core value of full affirmation of LGBTQ people.
Yes.
To say that differently, our ethos of, quote, it all belongs, does not mean that someone with a non-affirming theological stance will receive equal hearing here at Sojourn. In fact, we've had opportunities over the past 7 years to have guest speakers or workshop presenters share here at Sojourn, but Kate and I have always vetted them on this value of ours. And some otherwise great folks, we've had to say, no, I'm sorry, you're an amazing person, doing great work in the world, but here at Sojourn, this inherent value of LGBTQ people is too important to us. So if you're not clearly with us on that, then, to quote Randy Jackson, it's a no from me, dog. I'll just be honest. I don't think we bring Randy Jackson into enough sermons. I'm even conscious right now of we've had people who have sought to be in positions of leadership, like serving on the elder board. And when it has come to our attention that they're not affirming of LGBTQ people, we're like, you're a wonderful human. And sorry, like at that level of leadership, we need a commitment to these shared values. So I hope that makes sense, some of the difference between core values and dialogismos, or doubtful matters. I remember a number of years ago being in an event with Nadia Boltz-Weber, who I'm sure some of you are familiar with. And she said something that stuck with me for years now. She said, I, as a pastor, at that time she was pastoring a local church, she said, I'm not responsible for what the people in my church believe, but I am responsible for what they hear. And so Kate and I have taken flack, and we have, from people over the years, for protecting the microphones at Sojourn Grace from people who don't align with our core values. But for us, it has always been hashtag flack worth taking. Can we get that trending, anybody?
Is that a popular hashtag?
I think it's... So I needed to start there because when I eventually get to the part in this message, and it's really coming next week, but a little bit of it this week, where I specifically challenge the strong in faith to hold space for and welcome the weak in faith, never will that mean abandoning our commitment to our core values. And if you want to dig more into that particular aspect of this, head back a few weeks ago to Kate's message about being a belonging doula, about how our responsibility is to protect and nurture the space. So, with these early churches, Paul was under no illusion, and neither are the leaders here at Sojourn, that there will be or should be agreement on everything. Rather, the goal is to figure out how to live peaceably with one another in the context of disagreement over the dialogismos, the doubtful matters of religious ideas. So, to that end, Paul actually gave, and I kind of think this is really brilliant, Paul gave a different set of instructions to these two groups of people in the community. So verse 3 says this, to those who eat, you must not look down on the ones who don't. And the ones who don't eat must not judge the ones who do. So if we imagine a spectrum of a posture of faith with weak on one end and strong on the other, and again, we'll dig into these two descriptions soon. Depending on where you find yourself on the spectrum, you're invited to one of two practices. One of two attitudes, one of two things basically not to do. So those who are weak in faith are told, don't judge. Which means don't put asunder, don't put separation, don't pronounce someone to be in the wrong. Because in the eyes of the weak, which were the people, if you remember from last week, those are the ones who are like, no, we can't eat any meat, can't drink any wine. In the eyes of the weak, if you do eat meat or you do drink wine, you're actually doing something wrong. The weak, in other words, are like judgy McJudgertons. And I'm sure, as soon as I say that, you can picture in your mind people in your life who fit that description pretty well. And then on the other end, there are those who are strong in faith that Paul says, don't look down on those who abstain from meat and wine. And the word here means to despise or to think less of. And this is slightly different than judging because technically speaking, the weak weren't really doing anything. In fact, they were abstaining. So it's not like they were judging the weak. It's more like the strong had this attitude of, give me a break. There's nothing wrong with eating meat. Get over it. What a silly, antiquated idea. That's the despising, the looking down. A modern day example and a personal example might be the attitude that I sometimes have toward my wife when she's driving on the highway and does not use the carpool lane. Her left lane abstinence triggers the snobby elitism in me, where I find myself thinking but hopefully not saying, seriously, why not do the thing that will make your life more fun and interesting and enjoyable?
And it won't.
So you might say the strong in faith are like condescending McCondescendertons. Doesn't quite have the same ring as Judgy McJudgertons, does it? And I would suggest to you that if no one comes to mind as quickly in this camp as they do for Judgy McJudgerton, then maybe it you. It's just a consideration. Or maybe it's just my own projection here. But you get the idea. To one group, their Achilles heel is how they think those who believe and practice differently are immoral. So Paul says, stop judging. And then to the other group, their Achilles heel is how they think less of those who believe and practice differently. To their high-minded spiritual snobbery, Paul says, stop despising, stop looking down, stop patronizing. But then he takes a step further even, and he suggests that the whole lot of them, everyone here, everyone holds their own convictions equally rooted in a desire to do right by their understanding of who God is and what it means to live well. And I love this part because while Paul identifies himself as being on the strong end of the spectrum, at the same time doesn't have the opinion that he is therefore on the right or better side. Verse 5, each person must have their own convictions. Someone who thinks that a day is sacred, they think that way because of God. Those who do eat whatever they want, they eat and they give thanks to God. Those who don't eat, those who abstain, they also do that because of God. Verse 10, so why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you look down on your brother or sister? We will all stand in front of the judgment seat of God. Now, if the language of judgment seat of God trips you up, it's understandable. I just think what Paul was trying to communicate was that everyone is ultimately responsible for themselves with regards to how they live out their convictions. And regarding this idea of each person living out their convictions, Paul keeps going down this thread, and he suggests that sometimes, listen to this, sometimes morality itself is pretty stinking subjective. Check this out in verse 14. Paul says, I'm convinced that really nothing is wrong to eat. This is Paul identifying as the strong in faith. Like, I know that I'm convinced it's fine to eat whatever you need to eat. But if someone does think it's wrong to eat, it actually becomes wrong for that person. And then a few verses later, Paul again affirms all food is acceptable, but it actually becomes a bad thing. All food is good, but it actually becomes bad if in the eating of it, it trips someone else up. I mean, think about this for a second. If someone just thinks something is wrong to eat, then it becomes wrong for that person. I imagine Chidi from The Good Place spinning out on the principle of ethics here. I don't think it's a stretch to say, and some of you are more involved than me, and you maybe this isn't where you're at, but me and others often operate as though there is a dualistic mentality where things are either objectively good or objectively bad, objectively right or wrong. But there's an argument to be made that it's maybe not that simple, that a good thing can be bad, that a wrong thing can be right, and vice versa, and it's not always clear or obvious. When I was studying for this talk, I came across this line from one of my books on Romans, and he writes this. I think his name is Brandon Byrne, writes, what determines the ethical quality of human action is not simply the objective order, but the disposition and the attitude of the subject as well. Hence, when a person, albeit erroneously, thinks that something is unclean in the technical sense of a taboo, that thing really is unclean for that person. In other words, I might say, what's the actual real world difference between something being truly objectively unclean versus someone sincerely believing in their mind that a clean thing is unclean? Like if you could get inside their brain, I'm not sure there's a tangible difference between the two. If a person believes in their heart of heart that action X is wrong, then for that person, action X is, for all intents and purposes, wrong. The weak in faith believed that eating meat was wrong, and the strong didn't. The weak in faith believed it was necessary to hold to and honor certain religious festivals, and the strong didn't. And Paul was trying to get both sides to see how they each were right, because sometimes the virtue of a given belief or behavior is subjective to the individual. Now, let me pause and say that, of course, this concept can be pushed too far. Of course. Pick any example you want. The person who feels in their heart of hearts, hey, scamming people and stealing their identity is fine. It doesn't make it fine. Or, hypothetically speaking, rich parents who cheat on their child's SATs to get them into elite schools just because they think it's fine. Doesn't make it fine. Or just, you can imagine your own extreme egregious behaviors where someone might think, I'm totally okay with taking another person's life. It doesn't just make it fine because the person feels like it's okay. So obviously it's insufficient to say that all morality is subjective and up to the person in question. But as far as I can tell, where those lines get drawn, like how all of it gets sorted out, I think this is the hard work of the community in question to figure out. Whether it's a state or a nation or a church, those who strive to build meaningful and vibrant and safe and creative and diverse communities must ultimately decide which sorts of behaviors are deemed, quote, not okay because they threaten the well-being of the larger group. And then, since we are a church, and we are talking about faith communities here, I'd add this. There are those who maintain that the Bible is sufficient and solely authoritative in this regard, meaning all we need is the Bible to know how to live ethically and build responsible and just societies. The room didn't like that. But I find, and clearly everyone else here does, I find this position rather naive because the world today is far, far removed from the cultures and the context in which the Bible was written. I mean, seriously, we can't go to the Bible for direction on issues like stem cell research or proper nuclear weapon etiquette or the ethicality of cloning or how to manage voting laws or the merits of different types of diets or how to deal with online privacy or how to engage with social media in a healthy way. I hope you get my point. I think at best, the Bible offers some interesting insights into how some of our ancient forefathers and foremothers dealt with situations in their time. And sometimes we can draw out some really helpful principles or values that might transcend. But at worst, and this is what a lot of us have seen, is we take one verse or one platitude, we rip it out of its context, and we declare the matter settled. Well, Psalm 139, we read, "You knit me together in my mother's womb, therefore stem cell research and cloning are forever forbidden." It's like, well, what if the scientists promised to use knitting needles? No, just kidding. The point I'm trying to make here is that Paul, thanks Karen for the pity laugh. The resident knitter in the room appreciated the knitting joke, which you don't get enough knitting jokes.
I don't. I felt seen.
The point I'm trying to make here is that Paul, while helping these churches navigate their diversity of belief and behavior on these dialogismos, these doubtful matters, Paul teaches that both sides have good reasons for their convictions. And the relative nature of it all needs to be held with care. I was thinking through this and I'm like, what might it be like if we tried to imagine this context, this situation from God's perspective? Hey, God, so, come on, just level with us. When it comes to eating meat, is it good or bad? Is it right or wrong? Come on. And we might think that God actually has an answer for that. We might think God really would pick one of the two options. And then if we can deduce which the God-picked option was, well, now we've got a handle on, quote, absolute truth, and we can start building a religion around it. Yet Paul suggests that, and this goes back to a bit of what I said last week about why I still sometimes bother with Paul, because I think he was a pretty radical theological thinker for his time. Paul seems to think that, according to God, she's totes fine with either approach. In Paul's mind, God might say, oh, you think eating meat is okay? Cool, me too. Oh, but you think eating meat is wrong? Right on, same here. So am I saying that, quote, it all belongs might be one of God's catchphrases too? But how, you might ask? How can both of these be true at the same time? What's the right path, eating meat or not eating meat? And what I'm learning from this passage is that you can't divorce a question like this from the subjective reality of the person in question. It matters what their life experience has been. It matters what values and convictions they hold in their heart and how they got them. So when we go around either judging people because we think they're doing something wrong, or looking down on people because we think their beliefs and behaviors are silly or antiquated, either way, I think we've entered into places we don't really belong, casting our opinions from the island of ignorance. I'm reminded of the creation story in Genesis, and that detail where God gave Adam and Eve access to all things in creation. Everything is yours except one. The one thing was the fruit from the tree of the knowledge between what is good and what is evil. It's as though God wanted to reserve just one thing for himself: the knowledge, the discernment, the capacity to judge what is good and what is evil, what is right, what is wrong. And I think maybe that's because our ancient spiritual ancestors stumbled upon this profound truth that human beings armed with such knowledge, or rather the illusion that we have such knowledge, will only ever screw things up. Perhaps it is only God, in her infinite wisdom, that can eternally hold the potential for two sides of doubtful matters to both be true. All right. So we're starting to put the pieces together here, I hope. In a diverse community, inevitably there will be disagreements over doubtful matters, these secondary issues that are not connected to the core values. How might we then navigate this disagreement? Well, if your faith is on the weaker side, your challenge, your invitation, is to not judge other people. If your faith is on the stronger side, your challenge is to not look down upon others. And both sides would do well to remember that the other side is likely doing the best they can to live out their convictions with integrity. I was reminded this week of a well-known quote whose origins are unknown. It's often, I think, falsely attributed to St. Augustine. But I think it sums up pretty well the ground that we've covered so far. And some of you know this. It's in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; and in all things, charity. And I think it's a great sentiment. I've seen a lot of churches use this over the years to try and name their approach to religious diversity. But I think just left to itself, just as a nice little saying, it's not enough. It's not sufficient. Because when it comes to the real life messiness of community and the real life tension within relationships, platitudes can just fall short. Plus, between you and me, I think a lot of churches smuggle in some of these non-essentials into the essentials category. And I don't honestly know how many of us really know how to practice charity in all things with regards to people that we disagree with. But it's a lovely saying, and in principle I agree, but I do think it needs some more meat on the bones. Which brings us, finally, need to drink a coffee for this. Finally, brings us to the point where we get to unpack Paul's ideas of weak faith and strong faith, which for the longest time I really struggled with. I didn't like Paul's choice to describe some as having weak faith and others, including himself, as strong. It felt elitist. It felt pejorative. It seemed counterproductive to what he was trying to do with regards to reconciling these fractured communities. But I think recently I've finally begun to grasp maybe what he was trying to articulate with these terms. And I kind of dig it now. Because what I think Paul might be saying here is that if things are going to work, meaning if this community is going to thrive within the context of religious diversity, it will be because the strong in faith see it as their responsibility to hold space for the weak, not the other way around. And it's that particular aspect of this passage that I find the most intriguing, the most challenging, and some of what I take issue with, which is why I only give Paul a B+ here. Because I think he left some things out or was just ignorant to some things. And so that's where I'm going to start next week. Don't worry, I can feel some of you like, holy crap, do we got to buckle in for like 10 more minutes of Colby here? No, you don't. We're like pretty much done here. But next week, we're going to start by getting into the weeds of what it means to have weak faith and what it means to have strong faith and how it is we might shift from weaker to stronger. But just to whet your appetite a bit, I'll leave you today with this conjecture into this weak, strong spectrum. Just a little morsel to get your minds pondering this week. And I do so at the risk of creating another binary. And I know that part of the goal here is to break down this dualistic mentality because it tends to divide us. Nonetheless, with a bit of trepidation, I propose that it may not be a huge leap of logic to think of weak faith as more conservative/traditional posture and a strong faith as a more progressive one. Well, where did that go? Did that disappear? Looks like it had a fade out build. Yeah, I'm goodbye.
Sinking into the abyss.
I don't know what's happening. It's just
What?
that was the Spirit of the Lord being like, and you're done. Anyway,
Did you come back?
I think I'm back. But anyway, you get hopefully the graphic over here was weak faith, conservative/traditional posture, and strong faith, progressive. Now, by that, I don't mean that weak faith is like 21st century evangelicalism and strong faith is 21st century progressive Christianity. I think that is the sort of elitist attitude of looking down that isn't really all that helpful. And it also just kind of conveniently puts me in the strong faith category, which is maybe a little too convenient. But what I mean by this conservative progressive spectrum is that generally speaking, to be conservative means you conserve the gains of the past. It just means that you believe that truth and goodness have already been discerned and established and figured out, and now the goal is to preserve that, to hold on to the faith of the past. Whereas to be progressive means you just have this posture, this belief that truth and goodness might still yet be discerned and attained and figured out ahead of us. There is progress to be made, in other words, which might mean you end up abandoning or amending traditional ideas, beliefs, and practices. And if I'm right about the connection here between conservative with weak and progressive with strong, then maybe the implication is this: in order to maximize flourishing and minimize suffering within a community made up of a diversity of doubtful matters, it might very well be that those of us who are more progressively minded are called to bear the weight of holding the space for those with more conservative beliefs. Asterisks with some exceptions, and that's where I'll pick it up next week.